Ladies and gentlemen, we might make a start at least with acknowledgements. My name is Tony Huey and I'm the Chair of the Board of Debating SA, and it's my great honour to welcome you this afternoon to the Grand Final for 2013 of the Open Division. Today, of course, marks the conclusion of another fantastic season of competition and debating. I congratulate and thank all debaters who have taken part this year, and I hope that along the way you've continued to learn good things about debating as a wonderful art and a wonderful craft. Those skills stay with you throughout your life. Skills such as research, analysis, clear thinking, often under pressure, teamwork, seeing different perspectives on issues, particularly having to argue the case for a particular matter that you may not personally agree with, having to formulate logical, evidence-based arguments, developing confidence in speaking in front of your peers, your friends, teachers, parents, even strangers. And of course, and most importantly, having a great sense of fun and enjoyment along the way. Debating SA continues to be committed to promoting and supporting debating in this very valuable developmental skill for young people. This year we've had 170 teams representing 47 schools across the 3 educational sectors in Adelaide. Some 780 students have participated, and that's a fantastic number. We're honoured to have the ongoing patronage of His Excellency the Governor of South Australia, Rear Admiral Kevin Scarce. I want to particularly thank today Professor Rick Saar, Professor of Law at University of South Australia, yes, I'll get it right, Rick, who has very graciously and kindly joined us today as a guest adjudicator. Rick has enormous experience and expertise in debating, and it's great to have you as part of our team. I want to publicly thank James Tran and Sonia Lowen for their unstinting commitment and hard work in organising and running our program throughout the year, as well as providing training and resources for schools. I thank the army of parents, coaches, teachers, adjudicators, families and helpers, all of you who have provided support in various ways for all our debaters. Our host schools this year have been Adelaide High, Pulteney Grammar, Grange Primary School, Nazareth College and Pembroke School. I thank all those schools for so generously making available their facilities, and I do look forward to seeing all the debaters and everyone else back hopefully next year for the 2014 season. Finally, what better place to hear our top debaters than in this, our House of Assembly, a most magnificent chamber in the Parliament of South Australia, which stands as a powerful monument and symbol of democracy, free speech and exchange of ideas. Debating SA is very grateful to the Honourable Chloe Fox, Minister for Bright and Minister for Transport, along with her parliamentary colleagues for allowing us to use this facility today. A reminder to the debaters, please, you are free and at liberty to use either the lectern or stand in front of the lectern as you wish. So I wish all debaters all the very best in the grand final today, and I'm sure we're in for a very, very enjoyable and engaging exchange of ideas. So without further ado, let the debating begin.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anthony Stocks, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2013 Open Division Debating SA Grand Final. The topic of this debate is presented in the form of a quadlibetical, which appears in today's program and is as follows. The ongoing conflict in Syria began in March 2011, following a series of peaceful protests by Syrian citizens as part of a wider movement known as the Arab Spring. The Syrian army responded with force in April 2011, leading, after months of military sieges, to an armed rebellion and conflict between the Syrian government and rebel forces. It has been confirmed by various sources, including Russian, British and French military experts and a special UN investigative force, that chemical weapons have been used during the conflict, most likely by the Syrian army, which has the world's third largest stockpile of chemical weapons, although the source of these weapons is unable to be conclusively proved. British Prime Minister David Cameron, US President Barack Obama and French President Francois Hollande believe that an intervention is necessary, although their respective governments do not or are yet to provide their support. The topic, therefore, is that there is no justification for any country to interfere with the internal affairs of Syria. Hoping to convince you of the truth of this afternoon's topic is the affirmative team from Sacred Heart College Senior, consisting of First Speaker Susan Salento, Second Speaker Daniela Nolan, and Third Speaker Riley Calaby. Trying to show you that this afternoon's topic is false is the negative team from Glenunga International High School, consisting of First Speaker Leslie J. Syria, Second Speaker Alexandra Nopov, and Third Speaker Nash Gorm. The grand final debate will be judged by a panel of 5 adjudicators who are Mr. Blake Wadlow, Professor Rick Saar, Dr. Sean Jolly, Miss Sonia Lowen, and Mr. Tony Huey. The speaking time of this debate is 8 minutes. A single warning bell will sound at 7 minutes, and a double bell will sound at 8 minutes. I ask that all mobile phones be switched off for the duration of this debate. I declare this debate open and call upon Susan Salento to open the affirmative case.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman. The topic of today's debate is that there is no justification for any country to interfere with the internal affairs of Syria. We, the affirmative team, take no justification to mean no adequate grounds for, that is, no beneficiary reason to support a decision. We understand interfere to mean, in the context of the topic, any external country actively supporting or resisting any group in Syria via material, monetary or military action. Concerning this definition of interfere, we exclude negotiation. Negotiation between states is an ordinary and regular intercourse in the international arena. It is merely an expression of foreign policy preference, aimed at attaining mutually satisfying resolutions to the many disputes that occur. Negotiation is not interference, as it is simply routine to the conduct of a country's external affairs. The internal affairs of Syria has already been outlined by our chairman, Anthony Stocks, so we therefore are debating that there is no admissible reason for any country to support or resist groups within the Syrian state. To convince you of the truth of this statement, I will be outlining how any such interference is a clear breach of international law that sets an unacceptable precedent, and how there is no impending need to impose on a state willing to communicate and cooperate. My second speaker, Daniela, will be discussing the potentially devastating consequences of interference and the uncertainty of supplying Syrian forces with materials from other countries. Finally, my third speaker, Riley, will be rebutting the negative team's arguments and summarising our case. When an illegal action occurs without approval, a precedent is set. That is, a tolerance for that action enters the category of being acceptable, repeatable. Being able to occupy oneself with the precarious situation of another country is not an act that can become acceptable. There exists a declaration, the Declaration of Principles of International Law Concerning Friendly Relations and Cooperation Among States, which was approved by the United Nations in October of 1970. Within this document is the following statement. No state or group of states has the right to intervene, for any reason whatever, in the internal affairs of any other state. Therefore, to intervene, for any reason, in the internal affairs of Syria is a direct violation of international law. Of course, in some circumstances, this can be justified. The declaration permits 2 such circumstances. 1, self-defence in the event of armed attack. It should be noted that this does not include premature self-defence. And 2, with the authorisation of the United Nations Security Council. At present, there is a distinct non-existence of countries that can claim either of those 2 exceptions. The Charter of the United Nations, signed on and actioned in 1945, contains the following in Chapter 7, Article 46. Plans for the application of armed force shall be made by the Security Council with the assistance of the Military Staff Committee. This means that if, say, the President of another country were to propose airstrikes on the Syrian state, they would be directly infringing on the sovereignty of the UNSC and international law. In other words, they would be facing the long-term consequences of committing crime on a global scale. To set a precedent of imposing on another country as self-appointed problem solver is entirely inexcusable. It is not within the state's authority to interfere in any way with the affairs of Syria, given no UNSC mandate has been issued, and there is very little evidence to suggest that the UNSC have any intention of doing so. It is very reasonable to say that a blatant violation of international law undoubtedly falls under the category of actions that cannot be justified. Why, then, are these actions being publicly discussed? Any such proposal, though still unacceptable, would only concern a country that is in dire need of external interference. However, with the demonstrated willingness of Syria to negotiate, Syria does not meet this category. On the 9th of September, the US Secretary of State, John Kerry, was asked what Assad's government may do or offer to avoid the proposed airstrikes by the Obama administration. He, rhetorically, recommended that the Assad regime may surrender their chemical weapons stockpile to international forces. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov heard this suggestion and encouraged such action, saying that it will, to quote, make unnecessary any strike against the Syrian Arab Republic. It will, especially given that on the 10th of September, Syrian Foreign Minister Walid al-Muallem publicly agreed to this plan for external groups seizing and destroying their chemical weapons. Therefore, Assad's government has clearly and definitely signified that they are prepared to operate within the frameworks of international law. They have thus also demonstrated that negotiation can and is being achieved, marking Syria's intention to, as Lavrov says, make any strike unnecessary. In regards to engaging in military action that will almost definitely spur lethal conflict between numerous countries, such act cannot be conscientiously endorsed if it is not necessary. Interference of lethal consequence that is not necessary is not justified. This principle does not only apply to military action. It should be understood by any reasonable person that there is no adequate reason to dabble in the affairs of another country when effective communication is working towards agreement. And working well, with John Kerry on Monday outlining a framework document which details that Syria's chemical weapons must be destroyed or removed by mid-2014. This very much negates the effectiveness of intervention as a short-term solution. It is not in any country's interests or liability to interfere with a country in a state of war when it has proved itself willing to cooperate. Ladies and gentlemen, it is evident merely through observation of law and proven effective communication that any interference with the internal affairs of Syria will not be necessary, will not be legal, and will not be justified.
I call upon Leslie J. Syria to open the negative case.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, fellow debaters, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for today's debate is that there is no justification for any country to interfere in the internal affairs of Syria. Firstly, before I introduce the negative team's case, I would like to clarify that we do not intend to create a concrete plan of action for Syria. However, we will be arguing that some countries have sufficient justification to take action. Before I begin my speech, I'd like to point out some major flaws in the opposition's arguments. Firstly, there's another thing that we'd like to clarify. Just because something is justified doesn't mean it necessarily has to be illegal. What we are here to discuss is whether or not there is an issue in Syria and whether this requires an interference. The opposition have also claimed that it is an issue in Syria that they are able to resolve independently, and hence there is no need for an interference. If Syria is able to resolve the issue independently and peacefully, then why isn't al-Assad doing this right now? It is clear that al-Assad's resolutions to the Syrian crisis involve violence, as he has exhibited in his open fire on peaceful protesters during the Arab Spring. We have already refrained from interfering in this crisis for a while now, and it has since escalated. The delays for an interference need to halt. We can no longer maintain this irrational ideal that everything will eventually settle, because as we sit idly, awaiting peace, we sit idly by observing the death and destruction of an entire nation. And as I'll further discuss in my speech, the consequences of inaction, such as possible genocides, is in itself proof that there is justification to interfere. The opposition also insinuated that the UN should be the only international body that should engage in interference through the approval of the Security Council. Ladies and gentlemen, let us analyze what the UN are doing right now. Nothing. The UN may have this sovereignty, but it is given its power by its people. It is a construct, not a country, and constructs adapt, not dictate adaptation. Just because the UN preaches inaction does not mean that we should simply step back. If countries did not participate in actively working together, there would be no UN, and so it lies with the UN to allow the countries the collective responsibility afforded by them, by one of the greatest alliances our world has ever seen. We cannot sit idly by awaiting a response from the UN as Syria continues to suffer. Today I will discuss how it's the country's responsibility to protect Syria, how the Syrians are asking for assistance, and the consequences of inaction. Our second speaker, Alexandra, will discuss Syria's breaches in international law and the external effects of this conflict. The central focus of international law has always been the welfare of humanity, leading to the incitement of international interference. This leads to my first point, the responsibility to protect initiative. This doctrine of international law reinforces the responsibility of sovereignty. According to this doctrine, since the government of Syria is failing to protect its people, the responsibility falls from them to us, the rest of the globe, to take action. If the UN maintain inaction as they are now, then it becomes our responsibility, the individual countries, to assist. The problem with Bashar al-Assad's approach is his use of violence. His solution to his nation's problems is raining destruction upon it, hurting himself and his country by infringing the responsibility to protect through his countless war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, this responsibility has fallen into our hands, acknowledging our right to interfere. This form of interference always prioritizes the use of humanitarian or political interference, with military action reserved only as a last resort. Our second speaker, Alex, will elaborate on this. However, it is clear that al-Assad's methods have been both ineffective and detrimental. Since the government itself is acting so irresponsibly, we are obligated to maintain the responsibility to protect for them. We must, by law, afford the Syrians the same safety we afford ourselves. By that same token, my second point is spun. We should treat them as we would expect to be treated, answering their requests for assistance as if they were our own. It may seem ambiguous. If the country needed help, shouldn't the current government be requesting such aid? Certainly they should. However, al-Assad has tried for independence and is sticking to his guns. No, ladies and gentlemen, it is not the government that needs help. It is the majority of the Syrian people who have been formally and informally reaching the consensus that they need help to maintain international law and resolve this crisis. Al-Assad's coalition of opposition agrees, saying our friends in the West, in Turkey, in the Arab world, if they want to help us, then they can do that by putting the clearest possible pressure on the Syrian regime to stop targeting civilians. This view is shared by an ever-increasing circle of Syrian citizens and the League of Arab States, who declare that the coalition are a true representative of the aspirations of the Syrian people. When we look back on this historical event, and we will, there will be endless ringing echoes of agreement that this violence should have ended, that international assistance was needed. It is needed and wanted. There is no plausible argument against these points, nor is there any doubt about the potential consequences of inaction, which leads me to my third point. There are many plausible, peaceful solutions to this crisis. While it is admirable that we have tried to find a way to let Syria maintain independence, they fail to see that a helping hand does this as well, and that a helping hand is all that it takes. Let me bring you back to 1994 Rwanda, when we let the blade of inaction run through 1 million men, women, and children, the Rwandan Civil War. In the case of Syria, the world has done the right thing so far. They have considered, as doctrine dictates, all other options, and it is clear that they cannot, that they must not do nothing. And even in the worst case scenario, we have saved millions through military interventions in countries such as Cyprus, Lebanon, and even East Timor. There is a difference, ladies and gentlemen, between the inaction we have seen in Rwanda and the inaction that the world currently exhibits. One was a conscious decision to abandon a nation in turmoil. The other, currently, is a meditation on how to approach the situation based on past experiences. One, ladies and gentlemen, was so greatly regretted that global law was forever changed with the creation of the responsibility to protect. The other now brings us together in suffering that we might one day celebrate peace. As you can see, Rwanda foreshadows a past yet possible future for Syria if we allow them to be speared by the blade of inaction. These arguments I presented to you touch only the surface of what has happened and could happen in Syria. But they are based on truths, both past and present, accessible to all of us, no matter who or where we are. We are defined by our choices, ladies and gentlemen, and should we choose to ignore Syria's pleas when we know what could happen, it rests upon us, the responsibility of mourning those who we chose to let die. As the saying goes, many leaves, one tree. And in the autumn of any bloody conflict, we must fall to the aid of even one leaf.
To continue the affirmative case, please welcome Daniela Nolan.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chair. As we are all aware, the topic of today's debate is that there is no justification for any country to interfere with the internal affairs of Syria. And to demonstrate to everybody here today that this is in fact the case, I must address some of the flawed points raised by the negative team. Firstly, they claimed that the UN are just sitting by and simply doing nothing. However, we pose an argument to this. They are actually discussing and investigating many of the affairs going on within Syria. However, they are not acting immediately because they realise that the consequences of interference will be catastrophic. The second speaker also made the misguided distinction that we are debating whether it is justified, not whether it is illegal. However, in the matter of discussing actions that are justified, or whether whether or not it is against the law is absolutely a deciding factor to consider. The first speaker also said, in response to the progress of international negotiation, that it is not the government that needs help, but the Syrian people. However, the benefit of not intervening is in the interest of all Syrian people, government and citizens alike. Also, rebel groups have more military power than civilians, and these rebel groups have publicly stated that they despise any ideal of Western or foreign intervention just as much as they despise al-Assad himself. So can we not see that this is all leading to support our case? Now, if this in itself was not enough to convince everybody here of our point, please allow me to address some further issues. Firstly, the destabilising effect of any country's intervention into the internal affairs of Syria would have tremendous detrimental consequences, which makes it unjustifiable in itself to intervene at all. Intervention in international affairs over the past decade has proven time and time again that the only foreseeable outcomes are negative, including mass loss of life, economic consequences, and creations of new internal and external conflict. Furthermore, by destabilising a country, a perfect breeding ground for terrorism is created, where extremist groups are able to plan and develop, recruit and train followers in order to implement further chaos. Numerous interferences have displayed this, such as the French intervention in Mali. It has been noted by Seamus Millen, established writer at The Guardian, that the past decade has demonstrated beyond doubt that interventions do not solve crises, let alone deal with the causes of terrorism, but deepen them and generate new conflicts. Considering this pattern, ladies and gentlemen, does it not make it obvious that any intervention into the internal affairs of Syria will actually worsen the situation? This idea seemed apparent to renowned Middle Eastern diplomat Hassan Rouhani, who stated that any interference in the region will pose irreparable dangers to the stability of the region and will merely lead to the spread of extremism and terrorism. For this reason, we can assure you that there is absolutely no grounds on which one could justify intervening in Syria's internal affairs. Which relates to my second point, ladies and gentlemen, that it is not prudent to provide weapons to either side of the conflict when one does not know what will happen to them afterwards. This is exceptionally important when one takes into consideration the history of providing weapons or support to a rebel group with whom full cooperation is not guaranteed. By drawing on to one of the many historical examples, we can successfully draw parallels to the Syrian situation. In the mid to late 20th century, Afghanistan had multiple rebel groups, all fighting against the government, causing conflict and unfortunate conditions for civilians. In an attempt to lower the conflict, the United States intervened in the internal affairs of Afghanistan by providing financial and weaponry assistance to the rebel groups. By 1987, the US government was providing $700 million worth of military assistance per year and was sending a steady supply of 65,000 tons of arms to the Mujahideen, who are known as Islamic extremists. At the time, this appeared to be supporting the best interests of the Afghan people, just like at the time, the negative team seems to think that intervening will support the best ideas of the Syrian people. However, beneficiaries went on to form a terrorist group known as the Taliban, who eventually gained power over Afghanistan and now hold the responsibility of tremendous numbers of violence against innocent people, exposing Afghanistan to a far worse situation than it already had. The living conditions became disastrous. Human rights offences were paramount. Amnesty International stated that Afghanistan under the Taliban is a human rights catastrophe, Afghan women describe themselves as the living dead because the conditions are so deplorable. For women to even laugh in public was punishable by either public removal of limbs, lashing or brutal execution through stoning, hanging, or being buried alive and crushed by a falling wall. This doesn't seem to be of any benefit to the Afghanistani people. If we now compare this example to the Syrian situation, we are able to draw parallels. Like Afghanistan, Syria has multiple rebel groups, all fighting to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. The most successful and aggressive of these rebel groups is known as the Jabhat al-Nusra, who are known to contain 10,000 members with alliances to Al-Qaeda. To look at this broadly, any intervention intended to assist these rebel groups will directly promote the success of Al-Qaeda and further terrorist movements. This would undoubtedly lead Syria into the same devastating circumstance in which Afghanistan finds itself. A future where human rights abuses are a daily occurrence and living conditions are disgusting. The United States already supporting these rebels with knowledge of the rebels' alliance to Al-Qaeda. However, their current actions reflect past examples and are therefore bound to fail. Finally, removing al-Assad will definitely not lead to an end of violence in Syria. Syria's multiple rebel groups are united by only one objective: to remove the president. However, if he was removed, catastrophic conflict would arise between the rebel groups and religious and ethnic sects in order to attempt to gain power. The rebel groups and religious sects all have contrasting ideologies, and growing tensions in these ideals have already led to clashes between the groups, such as the example on September the 18th, where the Free Syrian Army and the Islamic State of Iraq descended into open conflict on the streets. Since violence is already present within the rebel groups and religious sects, one can clearly see the extent to which this would escalate if Assad fell to power. Thus, one cannot justify any type of interference in Syria's internal affairs, as it would risk escalating pre-existing problems, while simultaneously creating more. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, due to the detrimental consequence of destabilising effect in Syria, the risk of providing weapons to rebel groups with whom there is no guarantee of compliance, and the fact that removing Assad from power will not in fact remove violence in Syria, it is unequivocal that there is no justification to interfere in Syria's internal affairs.
To continue the negative case, please welcome Alexandra Notloff.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Before I continue to prove to you that there is indeed justification for interfering in the internal affairs of Syria, I will first point out some of the major flaws in the opposition's argument. The first speaker of the affirmative team talked about how interfering in Syria would be a breach of international law. Firstly, she only said that military strike would be a breach of international law, and nowhere in their definition did they state that military strike was the only form of intervention that would qualify. So clearly, the course of action here would be to use some other form of intervention, perhaps humanitarian intervention. They've also conveniently ignored the crimes against humanity, which are a breach of international law that have been committed under al-Assad's regime. It's ironic that the affirmative team talks about the Taliban and the atrocities that they have caused, yet conveniently ignore what is happening in Syria right now. They've also said that Syria is willing to communicate and negotiate, and therefore interference is not necessary. However, let's just take a moment and consider the fact that Syria's apparent willingness to negotiate and communicate has only come about in the past, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, past month. This is only in response to the US threat of a military strike. Clearly they are not acting because they have suddenly realised that feel bad for everything they've done to the Syrian people. They're acting because they're trying to prevent a military strike in their country. What about the hospital that the Syrian army bombed while they were negotiating terms with Russia last week? What about the people who were killed in this conflict while Syria was being oh so willing to communicate? The second speaker of the affirmative team said that the UN is taking action by discussing what should happen in Syria rather than rushing to interfere. However, the time has passed for discussion. There are people who are suffering in Syria right now, and if we just sit around and talk about what we could do instead of going in to help them, we are sitting back and letting atrocities happen. It's time to do something. The second speaker of the affirmative team has also talked about how the Syrian rebel forces have links to Al-Qaeda and how if we interfere and give support to them, we can't know what the outcome will be. However, we want to clarify that the Free Syrian Army, the key rebel force in Syria, have stated that they do not support Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda with FSA claiming that we do not support Al-Qaeda and will not allow them to come into power in the country. Here, what we have here is a guarantee from the Syrian rebel forces that Al-Qaeda cannot come into power in Syria and that they will not let this happen despite their alliance with Al-Qaeda in order to overcome Assad's rule. While Leslie, the first speaker of our team, looked broadly at moral obligation and at the consequences of non-interventionism, I'll be applying this more specifically to the Syrian conflict, proving to you without a doubt that there is a moral obligation to interfere in Syria in response to what has happened so far and what could still happen without interference. There is substantial evidence that throughout the Syrian war, the government has infringed on various human rights. One example of this is at the centre of the debate surrounding intervention in Syria, the use of chemical weapons, which is not just a crime against humanity, but is a breach of international law. Both our team and the affirmative side have presented arguments claiming that regarding international law. And here, what we have here is a moral. What we have here is it's two sides. We have to decide whether we're going to let the international law that states we can't infringe on a country's sovereignty, or if we're going to sit back and let the breach of international law that results in the loss of life just keep happening. Although the situation is constantly changing, with significant changes having occurred since even receiving this topic, the agreement that has been struck up to destroy Syria's chemical weapons stockpile does not change the need for interference in Syria. Firstly, although the Syrian government appears to be going along with the plan to destroy chemical weapons, there is no guarantee that they will actually follow through on this. Let's remember, this is the same government who initially denied their possession of the chemical weapons, then used them on their citizens, and then later denied using them, only to admit to possession weeks later. It's also important to note that any success so far in terms of working towards peace has been the result of American threats of a military strike, which I've already talked about. This is an example of interference in Syria's internal affairs, and it surely proves to you that interference does have the potential to be a positive force in this particular conflict. Without the threat of interference, Syria would not have begun to take these steps working towards achieving peace. If the Syrian government does in fact follow through and to give up their stockpile of chemical weapons, which would, by the way, involve further interference with representatives from the USA and Russia going into Syria to examine the chemical weapons stockpile, this does not change the crimes against humanity that have already been committed. If nothing is done in the face of these crimes this time, it sends out the message that similar tactics can be used by anyone without fear of retribution. What good is international law if it is not upheld? We must also remember that the use of chemical weapons is not the only crime against humanity that has been committed by the Syrian government. Going all the way back to the beginning of the war, in 2011, the army used tactics like open firing on demonstrators, a tactic which has had many reprisals. The UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, stated that we see neighbourhoods shelled indiscriminately, hospitals used as torture centres, children as young as 10 years old killed and abused. At the same moment, the Syrian government was negotiating terms with Russia last week, a civilian hospital was bombed, as I've already said. Over 100 were killed. It is time for the international community to be vigilant about the response to all crimes against humanity, the use of chemical weapons included, and to send a message that war crimes are intolerable and inhumane. Interference in internal affairs is one way to send this message, and is therefore a justified action. My second point this afternoon. Although the Syrian war is the result of the internal affairs of the country, this doesn't mean that the conflict isn't affecting outside nations. The conflict has created a situation that has already resulted in over 2 million refugees, 2 million people who have been forced to leave their country and must now find somewhere else to go. This means that obviously other countries are involved, since where are these people going to go if not other countries? The actual fighting itself has also had a more direct impact on other nations. Over 1,000 foreign civilians have been killed so far. These are internal affairs, conflict between one Syrian force and another, but they are having devastating impacts on the entire region. Lebanon, for example, being a tiny neighbouring country of Syria, is affected in many ways by the Syrian conflict. The sectarian divide in Syria is present in Lebanon as well, and the continuation of the Syrian conflict only heightens tensions in Lebanon, with violent conflict being a possibility there too. Other countries surrounding Syria could easily be affected in similar ways. Assad's argument that no country has the right to breach Syria's sovereignty is completely contradicted and undermined by the internal affairs of his country having such negative consequences on the wider region. Foreign intervention in Syria, whether it take the form of humanitarian intervention or providing military support to the rebels, could help bring the war to an end, which would prevent further risk to those in surrounding countries, as well as the Syrian civilians themselves, of course, and could potentially allow refugees to return home. This also undoubtedly proved that at least some countries have justification to get involved with the internal affairs of Syria, as these internal affairs are having external consequences. Many countries in the region have discussed the idea of some sort of interference in Syria in order to protect their own citizens. How can the affirmative team or anyone else say that their arguments have no justification? In fact, as we have proven to you this afternoon, and will continue to prove to you, there is absolutely justification for interference in Syria. As citizens in an increasingly connected world, it is our responsibility to take action and to set a precedent for what we accept and think is tolerable.
To conclude the affirmative case, I call upon Riley Calaby.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be able to speak with you this afternoon. International relations, ladies and gentlemen, is a field in which the slightest ambiguity in phrasing can be paid for in the blood of thousands. That is why it is so incumbent upon me to highlight the areas in which my opposition, unfortunately, have misled, engaged in terminological inexactitude, or just been plain wrong. The most egregious error I wish to highlight is their first speaker, Leslie's claim that other states hold a responsibility to protect Syrian civilians under international law. However, responsibility to protect, as it is understood in the field of international relations, is a much narrower concept than Leslie would have you believe, than my esteemed opponent would have you believe. If we examine the concept as it was first articulated by the UN General Assembly all the way back in 2005, responsibility to protect can only be invoked in order to, and I quote, help states to fulfil their responsibility to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. It is not a legally binding principle by itself, but rather an aspirational statement of how the collective security provisions of Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter could be realised. However well-intentioned, such an aspiration must clearly be overruled by the definite international law to which all states are subject of Chapter 7, Article 46, which states, plans for the application of force shall be made by the Security Council, not the US, not Iran, not France, not any one state or group of states, but the Security Council. We know that the Security Council is not willing at this time to authorise uninvited interference in Syria. China and Russia have made it clear that they would exercise their veto over any resolution authorising such a thing. Without wanting to trivialise the situation, invoking responsibility to protect to justify uninvited interference in Syria at the expense of the long-standing provisions of Article 46 of the UN Charter, it's a bit akin to running down a pedestrian to stop them from jaywalking. Interfering on the grounds of responsibility to protect would be privileging a vague aspirational statement without the slightest legal force over one of the foundational principles of international law as we understand it today. As the negative team's second speaker said, what good is international law if it is not upheld? I agree with her, absolutely. What good are the foundational principles of international law which hold that intervention is only legitimate in either self-defence or with a valid UN Security Council mandate if we do not uphold these? In any case, even if we do disregard the general invalidity of the negative's appeal to responsibility to protect, it's unlikely that the specific situation in Syria at the moment is covered under responsibility to protect at all. Responsibility to protect applies when, and I quote the United Nations, a state manifestly fails to protect its population from war crimes. Given that the provenance of the shocking chemical attacks on civilians is still unknown, and that the Syrian regime has actively invited international forces in to assist with the confiscation and detection of chemical weapons, as my first speaker Susan pointed out, it would be ludicrous to argue that the Syrian state is manifestly failing to act in response. Responsibility to protect can only apply, even with the limited authority it possesses, that is, none, if a state is so recalcitrant, so unwilling to prevent such things as the use of chemical weapons on its population that international collective action is warranted as a last resort. A state such as Syria, which is actively asking the international community for help in preventing the use of chemical weapons, is clearly not an international rogue warranting action under responsibility to protect. Thus, it would be wholly inaccurate and misleading to claim that any uninvited interference in Syria is justified by the concept. Going on with the theme of chemical weapons, the first speaker for the negative also incorrectly claimed that the UN is doing nothing. However, UN forces are already, at the invitation of Syria, deploying to prevent and confiscate chemical weapons and prevent their further use. It's scarcely sitting by. Their second speaker said that people are suffering now and that it's time to do something. On the contrary, it's time to make careful decisions to ensure that our haste to try and prevent atrocities occurring in Syria in the short term does not lead to a greatly destabilised long-term situation. The negative team have misleadingly claimed that there is evidence of war crimes, such as the use of chemical weapons, were committed by the Syrian government. However, UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon, who their second speaker has actually cited the report of, explicitly refuses to attribute the 21 August chemical weapons attack to either the Assad regime or the rebels. It is only a war crime to actually use chemical weapons, not to possess them. The rebel army stood to gain massively from conducting a chemical attack if it provoked US intervention against the Assad loyalists. We know that sarin gas, the particular chemical used in the attack, is extremely easy to be manufactured by amateurs. Given the lack of material evidence demonstrating the responsibility of either side of the attack, it would be irresponsible and inaccurate to attribute blame to either side at this point. Therefore, given this state of uncertainty, it is not possible for any international actor to interfere or intervene in such a way as to punish or deter the true culprit, rendering it impossible to justify interference on that basis. Finally, both of the negative speakers expect that you'll believe, ladies and gentlemen, that interference in Syria's internal affairs in the form of a humanitarian intervention is necessary to prevent civilian suffering. Of course, war is an abomination. I don't disagree with that. I don't think anyone in this room disagrees with that. Every death is a tragedy. It's only natural to want to do whatever is in one's power to end it. However, when we consider the situation reasonably and analytically, we can see that rushing in and interfering in Syria would, in the long term, not promote peace, but instead support the senseless slaughtering and suffering of Syrian civilians. This might come as a bit of a shock, but sending in more troops isn't the best way to promote stability and end conflict. I know. As a final resort, when atrocities are happening, the UN may provide a mandate for a humanitarian intervention in order to prevent the reoccurrence of war crimes, as many argue it ought to have done during the Rwandan genocide. However, given, unlike Rwanda, that there is little danger of further war crimes in Syria, and that the Syrian state is actively cooperating with international authorities to prevent them from happening, a humanitarian intervention, as it is understood in international law and practice, cannot be justified. In fact, UNICEF, the international agency responsible for the well-being of civilians in conflicts, argues that an intervention would make it more difficult to provide humanitarian relief because it would increase instability, making it harder for them to access the areas where civilians most need help. To summarise the case against interference in Syria, my first speaker, Susan, conclusively demonstrated that interference in Syrian internal affairs would be counterproductive if we really wanted to ensure global peace and security and prevent unnecessary harm to civilians, because in the long run, it would be a blatantly illegal act under Article 46 of the UN Charter and also the Declaration of Principles of International Laws concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states. Don't try that on one breath. It would establish a precedent of utter disregard for these foundational principles of international law, and the catastrophic long-term consequences would outweigh the short-term gains in Syria. It would also jeopardise the highly successful negotiations taking place now with the Assad regime. My second speaker, Daniela, continued, highlighting the multiplicity of practical factors, such as increased instability, increased sectarian conflict, the likelihood of terrorism being promoted, that prevent interference in Syria being justified on any grounds. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
To conclude the negative case and this afternoon's debate, I call upon Naish Gorn.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman. The negative team today has presented the justifications for interference in the conflict in Syria. Tonight, I'll be concluding my team's case, however, I would like to firstly point out the flaws in the opposition's. Ladies and gentlemen, I find it perplexing that the opposition can, amongst all three speakers, fail to talk about the atrocities occurring in Syria. They have failed to recognise the alleged genocidal tendencies of the sectarian divide. They have failed to talk about the open firing on protesters, the very beginning of this movement in the first place. How is it that we can attempt to come to a reasonable and informed decision about the conflict without observing the realities of the situation? It is interesting then that they go on to talk about the Taliban regime and the atrocities that they committed. But as my second speaker has pointed out, they have failed to acknowledge the atrocities occurring in the very country that we are talking about today. They have also accused the negative team, of terminological inexactitudes. But ladies and gentlemen, I would like to be permitted to point out a few terminological inexactitudes that they have themselves committed. First of all, they have conflated the two terms of interference and intervention. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, under the very own definition provided by the affirmative team, there are other forms of interference, such as political interference, such as the example that the Syrian regime has agreed to, where inspectors from the United States and Russia are going to be coming in the internal affairs of Syria, are going to be observing Syria's chemical weapons stockpiles, they're going to be assisting in the decommissioning process of Syria's stockpiles. Under the definition provided by the affirmative team, this is an example of interference. However, they have based their entire argument around this idea of intervention and a full-scale intervention. What they are in fact doing is committing the fallacy of the false dilemma. Either we completely stay out of Syria or we invade them. ladies and gentlemen, there are many shades of grey in between, and it is these nuances that the negative team is interested in talking about today. They have also equated the words illegal, ladies and gentlemen, with no justification. And whilst, of course, we agree that the law is something we inevitably have to consider in any decision, it is not binding that just because something is illegal, it is not. There is no justification for it. I quote the first speaker of the affirmative team when I say that when we accept an action without retaliation, we, quote, set a tolerance for that action. But ladies and gentlemen, why did they not recognise this exact same line of argument when applied to the abhorrent actions of the Syrian regime? Why do they not see that our failure to do anything in the face of chemical weapons attacks, in the face of crimes against humanity, why do they fail to see that this is setting a tolerance for that action, to quote the opposition? They have also said that arming rebels would be illegal under their definition, but they have failed to recognise that in fact Russia is the world's largest arms exporter to the Syrian Assad regime, and in fact they have failed to discuss that this action is in fact illegal. Therefore, by their own definition, the existence of the Assad regime and the current military engagements that is occurring in Syria would be, under their definition, illegal because they're being armed by an outside source. They have talked about a possible intervention being a blatant violation of human rights law. Ladies and gentlemen, a blatant violation of human rights law is being committed by the Assad regime. A blatant violation of human rights law is open firing on protesters during the Arab Spring. A blatant violation of human rights law is using chemical weapons against your own citizens. And in fact, if there are any doubt as to whether the Assad regime was in fact the perpetrator of this chemical weapons attack, we only need to listen to Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Britain, France, United Kingdom, Turkey, and the Assad regime's own allies, the militia Hezbollah, who have admitted that it was the Assad regime that used the chemical weapons attacks. To point to the United Nations report as being inconclusive is simply a scapegoat, because, ladies and gentlemen, that is the very essence of the United Nations, is to be inconclusive. They have also talked about, ladies and gentlemen, the entire argument has revolved around this concept of international law, but that opposition have not afforded the Syrian people the right to be treated under international law. There are daily occurrences of breaches of international law happening in Syria by the Assad regime. And so we find it incredibly hypocritical that the opposition refuses to acknowledge these occurrences whilst basing their argument around the concept of international law. If we want to talk about breaches of international law, let's look in 2008, whereas despite the United Nations ban, the Syrian regime armed the Hezbollah, the Lebanese militia forces in Lebanon, and continue to do so despite the United Nations proving a motion that this should not be occurring. They have also said that, quote, effective communication is working towards agreement in Syria. Ladies and gentlemen, at the same time as this effective communication has occurred, there was an attack on a civilian hospital, as my second speaker pointed out. We'd also like to alert you to the position of the rebels on this allegedly effective communication, and the fact that they are in fact very disgruntled that the United States and Syria are engaging in effective communication, because it's taking away the focus on the Assad regime and the atrocities that it's committing, and moving this focus to the more narrow focus of chemical weapons. And whilst, of course, we should be looking at the chemical weapons, we should not forget to look at the broader picture, as the rebels, the Syrian people themselves, are requesting that we do. If that effective communication is so effective, why is it that there is approaching 3 million refugees in neighbouring countries such as Lebanon and Turkey? Why are Lebanon and Turkey having to deal with the consequences of Syria's effective communication? They have also talked about the historical nature of interventions, pointing out that historically they fail, and used an example in the mid-20th century. Ladies and gentlemen, let's use an example from this century. Let's use an example from this decade. Let's have a look at Libya, when the no-fly zone was instigated in Libya. And of course, no one's arguing that Libya is the beacon of democracy in the modern age, but the fact is Libya has had effective, fair and open elections, democratic elections, and has produced a government that is not, unlike many states in northern Africa, is not an ideological militant party. Furthermore, the only refugees that have come out of Libya is a very inner circle of Gaddafi's family and his military. There has not been the same 3 million refugees that have been burdened in neighbouring countries. They have also stated that rebel forces themselves don't want an intervention, but ladies and gentlemen, this is factually inaccurate. As my first speaker quoted, the National Coalition for Revolutionary and Opposition Forces has stated that our friends in the West, in Turkey, in the Arab world If they want to help us, then they can do that by putting the clearest possible pressure on the Syrian government to stop targeting civilians. Ladies and gentlemen, finally I'd just like to point out a fallacy, that is that a correlation is not a cause. Just because an intervention sometime last century happened to produce the Taliban does not mean that an intervention sometime this century is going to happen to produce another despotic regime. In fact, we'd like to point out that the Free Syrian Army is forthright in the fact that it's non-sectarian, does not have a religious alliance, and does not support the Taliban. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to summarise the points made by the members of my negative team. Our first speaker, Leslie, has talked to you about the responsibility to protect doctrine and its applicability to the Syrian conflict. He then furthered our argument by pointing out that the voices of Syrians themselves are the loudest amongst those in the international community calling for another country to interfere. His last argument was a pertinent historical example of Rwanda, saying that if we do not learn from our mistakes, we're doomed to repeat them. Our second speaker, Alexandra, talked about the crimes against humanity that have been perpetrated against the Syrian people. And despite that the UN has not conclusively reached the chemical weapons we use, they have conclusively, in every report since 2011, acknowledged that war crimes have been used in other forms. She also talked about how the internal affairs of Syria are having external consequences on the neighbouring regions. So ladies and gentlemen, we are sure that you can see, as we do, that the time for inaction is over, and it is now time to prove our commitment to the common values of humanity.
I call upon a representative of the adjudication panel to come forward and award the debate.
Good afternoon, my name is Sonia Lowen. I'm the Training and Development Officer for Debating SA. Just before, and I hate to keep you in suspense like this, but I do have something that I'd like to speak about here. You know, Tony has graciously thanked James and I for the work that we do, and we really appreciate that you've said that. On the other hand, we'd like to thank all our board members. The chairman of our board, of course, is Tony Huey, Jeanette Huey, who's also on our board, Sean Jolly, Dr. Jolly's here today also, he's on our board, and we have 2 other members. So we actually work together in concert. We like to think, James and I, that we have Tony as the kind of rudder of and guiding us, because not so much myself, of course, I'm more mature, but James does come up with some really wacky ideas sometimes, and I like to think I come up with some innovative ideas, and we've always had Tony as our kind of guiding light. He has tried to reason out of being chairman one year where he said we should find someone else, but he just kept on being chairman, and finally we said, well, look, you've been here for another year, you may as well stay. So I think we've been very, very fortunate in having him as our chairman, and I'd like to thank you publicly and acknowledge all the work and help that you give to us, so thank you very much. Now, having said that, let's get on with business. I'd like to congratulate both teams. I think you've both done a marvellous job. I've seen both teams myself when I've been out and about during the year, and I think that you have really brought up the standard of debating today. I was really proud of both of you, and it's a split decision, but I'd like to congratulate the negative team.
I call upon a member of the runner-up team from Sacred Heart College to give a vote of thanks.
I'd like to thank everyone who came out today. I would especially like to thank everyone associated with Debating SA who has made today and the competition all throughout the year such a success. I'd like to thank, as was mentioned before, Chloe Fox for graciously arranging for us to use Parliament House for our debate today. Most of all, I'd like to thank our opponents, Glenunga, for being such a great team to debate against, for giving us such a satisfying and challenging debate. Thank you very much.